folks in, but I figured we'd go ahead and get started with the preliminaries. I'm Catherine Pemberton. If you don't know me, I'm the director of the Powder Magazine, and we're really excited to have the first of our fall series. It's all about tea. David Shields, Dr. David Shields is kicking us off, and we were just reminiscing. I think I first met him years ago when he was doing some talks about history and architecture in Charleston. And I had just read his book when he was at the Citadel. He authored Civil Tongues and Polite Letters in British America, which I love. He is now the Carolinas Distinguished Professor of English Language and Literature at the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina. And he's the author of many numerous books about all sorts of topics, American literature, performing arts. We were just talking about his experience with or his writings about photography and the history of food. And he can tell you more about that. He's sort of a Renaissance guy. He's hitting all the sensory stuff, which I think is really fascinating. He studied at the University of Chicago, English language at William and Mary, and he is from Washington, D.C. originally, David?
That's right. But since my dad was in the CIA, I spent the first years of my life in Japan.
Oh, wow.
And that's where I learned to love tea.
Nice. Well, he now lives in Columbia, South Carolina, and probably still enjoys some. I think he was having some just a minute ago. I think most recently, David has really become known as the flavor saver. He's been very instrumental in taking on historical research that has enabled the restoration of some really important historic crops through from the Bradford watermelon to the Carolina African runner peanut, the purple straw wheat, seashore black seed rye, Benny, purple ribbon sugar cane, and Carolina gold rice is a really big one. And he's authored a lot of things recently: Southern Provisions, the creation and revival of cuisine, the Culinarians, Lives and Careers of the First Age of American Fine Dining. He won the Southern Food Alliance's Keeper of the Flame Award and was a finalist for the James Beard Book Award in Food Scholarship. So he's currently, I believe, the chair of the Slow Food Art of Taste Committee. And I know he does a lot with the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation still. So I follow him on Facebook, and if you're like me, you'll see things come across your feed about David tracking down heirloom seeds. He's finding black walnuts in Tennessee. He's telling us about bird peppers, which is a new one on me, and has showing us pictures of ancient squashes, and that's just in the last couple of weeks. So it's always fun to kind of keep up and see what he's doing. But today he's really going to talk to us about some of the peculiarities of tea culture and how that sort of changed from pre-revolutionary to post-revolutionary tea rituals and consumption. So this is a great kickoff for our tea event. I should have mentioned, just to kind of start us off, if you are a guide and you're looking for tour guide recertification credits, just type your name and guide into the chat. And Tina's going to have our list. We'll send that over to Lee Burbidge at the city. Make sure you get your credits. And also, if you have any questions that occur to you as we go along, type them into the chat, and we're going to try and find some time at the end to pepper David with some questions. And we'll just kind of go from there. And I guess, Dave, just take it away and tell us all about Mrs. D and who she is and everything about tea.
Well, I'm so happy to be with you all talking about something which I love to the point of obsession. I drink about 20 cups of tea a day. Darjeeling in the morning, and about 2 o'clock, I switch over to various green teas. Now, you're thinking about the caffeine intake, I'm sure, but let me assure you that a green tea has about 30 milligrams of caffeine, while your average cup of coffee is dialing it at 135. So you're getting much, much less caffeine from your healthy cup of tea than you are from your coffee. Tea is the camellia plant, the Camellia sinensis, and it's prepared as a decoction. A decoction is a natural drug that is loosed in a liquid when it is heated. The intensity of the drug is increased or diminished by the amount of time that is remained exposed in the liquid. And in the case of tea, the intensity of the caffeine that's in the tea is determined by fermentation. Now, tea leaves left to their own resources after you pick them will ferment quickly, and that means they'll curl and become dry and black. And that concentrates more caffeine than if you stop the fermentation. If you pan fry the tea leaves within 15 hours of picking, that will cause a partial fermentation, which produces oolong tea. If you stop it by steaming almost immediately after picking, you get your classic green teas. In addition to these sorts of processes, which were discovered by the Chinese in about 500 years ago, there was an additional way of concentrating things by compaction. You would press certain teas together and bury them underground and allow them to absorb certain minerals. And this process was connected with a tea that was long considered illegal to import into the United States because of its intensity as a drug, and that's pu'er. But nowadays, pu'er tea is widely available. It's very earthy and smoky tasting. If you want to get some, I would recommend Upton Tea Company in Massachusetts. Now, anyone who lives in America and asks for tea in a hotel these days has some servitor bring out a box of things, and most of them are actually not camellia at all, but chamomile or dried orange peel. And the decoctions made out of these sorts of herbs and spices are called tisanes. And they also are prepared by steeping in hot water, releasing some things. Sometimes it's the same drug as tea, caffeine, as in the case of yerba mate. Guarana seed, cola nitida, and some things like cacao contain both caffeine and theobromine, which is a chemical which is also a stimulant associated chemically with caffeine. Now, what's interesting, in South Carolina, we have two plants, the only two plants in North America that are native to it, that have both caffeine and theobromine in them, the chocolate and the tea drugs. And these are Yaupon. There are two forms of it, Ilex vomitoria, which was the famous black drink of the Native Americans, and Ilex Cassini, which is the form that you see in the illustration here. I have a hedge of it in my backyard, but I tend not to clip the thing and make tea out of it. There are various companies all throughout the South these days, however, who are. Tea originated, as everyone knows, in China, but those origins are mythological. One of those myths speak of Emperor Xiangnong in 2737 BC, sitting under a tea tree. When some leaves fall into a cup of heated water, a servant had served him. You have to remember that since natural water contains all sorts of microbes and things like that, Chinese discovered early on, if you boil the water, it's much healthier. So it's not unusual for one to have a cup of heated tea served you. So anyway, these tea leaves come floating down from the tree above, settle into the surface of his cup, and infuse their flavor, which pleases the emperor no end, and he demands that this experience be replicated. This, of course, is an entirely fanciful origin story. The earliest archaeological remains are found in the Han tombs, which are, about a millennium later in terms of time. And tea doesn't become a general cultural obsession in China until the later 700s AD or CE. The Chinese, once they discover tea, begin to consider all dimensions of it entirely. Lu Yu, in his famous Handbook Cha Jing, speaks of the orderliness of tea drinking as being a kind of register of civility. This is an idea that will pass over into its European forms of consumption. He stresses cleanliness of the tea vessels, the purity of the water, and the delicacy of the tea leaves. All of these things contribute to the spiritual refinement of tea drinking. And given these preoccupations, the exquisite attention being paid to its presentation, it's not a mistake that a distinct material culture emerges with teapots, cups, and saucers. And the Chinese cups have no handles. They have rims and on the bottom, and you learn how to hold the bottom rim and the top rim like this. The fermented tea existed from the beginning, but green teas, once they discover how to interrupt the fermentation process, begin to dominate Chinese taste. And to this day, most Chinese people prefer green teas over dark teas. And in the 900s, people begin noticing terroir, that teas grown at certain altitude or in certain conditions of water and sunlight taste better than others. And so well before tea became an object of international trade, the Chinese had established a kind of hierarchy of teas that are worthy of consumption and those which are everyday consumption teas. I will say that, certain of the tea books were never entirely absorbed and translated into English, even in the 19th century. A later emperor writes a book-length treatise on the type of water that is best used in tea, I guess that just went by the wayside. Nowadays, only the top 3 leaves of new growth are plucked in terms of harvesting, and they're harvested first in spring, in March, late March, April, May, and this is called the first flush. And then late June, a second flush, and sometimes in certain territories, an autumn picking takes place, and this is autumn flush, and that depends on the extent to which your camellia plants are again producing new growth, leaf growth. The earliest picking is considered the most flavorful, complex, fruity, and vegetal, so first flush teas command the highest price. The higher in altitude the tea garden, the smoother, less tannic the taste. In China, India, Korea, and Ceylon, women undertake most of the labor of picking. So tea comes to Europe as a commodity in the first world trade system. And this was the system that grew up in the wake of the age of exploration and colonization. Items were discovered across the globe with sensational tastes and pronounced somatic effects. Drugs, if you will. Tea, coffee, chocolate, sugar, tobacco, wine, spice, capsaicin. Coffee came to Britain first via Vienna and via Turkey. It was an Islamic beverage. Thomas Garraway offered it in his coffee house in London in the mid-1650s. And it's good to think that this was the time of the Cromwellian Commonwealth, and the Puritans were in control. And the Puritans had a case against alcohol and drunkenness. And so when you had a beverage appear that seemed medicinal, that seemed stimulating, they promoted it. And an explosion in coffee houses occurred from 1650 to 1675. When the first tea comes into Britain, people don't know how to use it. We have descriptions of people boiling the tea leaves for hours and then letting it sit in a wooden cask for a month. And then the bung is put into the cask and it is drawn, and you put it in a mug and put the mug next to a fire and let the mug heat up. I think that such tea must have been so tannic that it made your teeth feel furry. Other misadventures of tea include the famous story of the Duke of Monmouth sending his family in Scotland a pound of extraordinarily expensive rare tea leaves, whereupon they boil it, throw away the water, and eat the leaves like spinach. So how did people learn to drink tea? Well, let's go back here. It was Catherine of Braganza, the unfortunate wife of King Charles II, who was from Portugal, who introduces the proper way to sip tea, which she learned because the Portuguese royal family made a tremendous fortune monopolizing the porcelain trade at that point in the 17th century. And they took the precaution of learning how the Chinese themselves consumed tea, as well as bringing in the tea wares. Now, Queen Catherine makes the tea the sort of center of her female-oriented court culture. One of the things that you have to understand is that Charles II was a bounder, and almost immediately after marrying Catherine, who was a sort of a beautifully souled person, the king installed his side wife, Elizabeth Palmer, in their actual palace. And Catherine found out about this. This was not the grounds of good relationships. So there was a kind of polarization in terms of court culture, with the women gathering around Catherine and men and a few of his mistresses around the king. So the women, the aristocratic women, learned to sip tea in-house using green tea and Chinese wares. Now, something else is happening at the time. All of this coffee is being served at a new sort of institution called the coffee house. Now, these were different than taverns. And one of the things about coffee houses is they became a venue for business. People who had been doing work in their households, and you can go into Charleston and see in the earliest part of the city, houses that had the business as part of the house, and the man of the house who conducted the business remained in premises for most of the time. Well, the coffee house permitted you to have another place where you could do work, and many men left the household, abandoning the wife to the children and whatever. And the women began to represent this. So you would have in the 1670s and 80s these poems about the contest of coffee and tea, and it's entirely gendered. Tea is the woman's drink, coffee, the man's drink. News was the discourse of the coffee house, and social news, called gossip, was the tidings of the tea table. Now, one of the things which is interesting about what happens to tea is that Catherine of Braganza served it straight, the way the Chinese did it. But there was a kind of understanding that tea was a drug, and it was like coffee. It produced these effects in your body, and it was like chocolate, and they were bitter. And what you did with bitter medicines was you dulcified them. That is, you added usually milk and honey or sugar to them. So you had coffee, tea, and chocolate, when they were served in Britain and other parts of Europe, served in a way that was completely different than the way that they were consumed in their home countries. The Aztecs put hot peppers with their chocolate and hot water. Coffee consumed straight up. Tea, always pure. No additives, no lemon, no sugar, no cream. I don't know how many of you have been to a British tea. They like to use this Indian Assam tea, which has really high caffeine and a very pronounced taste. and it almost cries out for cream. So it's no mistake that good Assam tea is the thing which is most congenial to those who like dulcified decoctions. Sugar and cream go well with Assam. So one of the things that happens is that if you're adding sugar and milk to your tea, then you have to have containers for sugar and milk appear alongside your teapot. Now, I'm going to have Ann Smart Martin, our next speaker, actually go into this expansion of the pottery connected with tea. But I just wanted you to be aware of why the milk and sugar showed up. It was due to this notion, these are medicines, these are drugs, these are bitter drugs. The way to get the medicine to go down was to add this spoonful of sugar and maybe some cream as well. So what exactly were the teas that were being sold in Charleston during the colonial period? We actually know a fair amount about them from advertisings. Singlo comes from the Songlao Mountains in Anhui Province, which is in east central China. And during the Ming Dynasty, it was monks in Songlo who first fried tea leaves in woks to stop the oxidation and fermentation, preserving the green color of tea. There's no tea now produced with this name of Singlo. But the green tea from Anhui closest in character is one called Tungzi. And some American tea companies now sell chunmi from Jiangxi province as Singlo. This is a mischaracterization. Don't fall for it. If you're going to want a colonial equivalent of Singlo, be going after that Tungzi. And you can get that. One of the great things about the age of the internet is that any tea that's imported in North America is up on some web somewhere. And all you have to do is either find the Chinese characters for this tea name or put in the closest Anglo equivalent. You'll notice that this tea is just imported from London, not from China. The second tea, which is important, is Hisong, which is a rolled green tea, also from Anhui province. And it's actually named not after anything in China, but the English tea merchant Philip Hyson. This was reckoned to be the most valuable green tea imported into colonial South Carolina. It had more caffeine, larger leaves, and more pronounced flavor than any other green tea imported to North America in the 18th century. After that, certain Tung Ting oolong teas had much larger leaves than any Hisong. But I found a good photograph of showing you how long these rolled tea leaves are. You'll notice in this ad, Rag and Company are some of the merchants involved here, and Singlo and Hyson are named. Imperial teas are actually a category of quality in the 18th century and don't designate an actual variety of tea. Now, Bohea tea is fermented black tea from the Wuyi Mountains in Fujian province. This variety was allowed to partially oxidize. It isn't a fully black tea like Qingwen. And it's sort of like the oolong tea closest to a black tea that's available. So they concentrate the flavor and the caffeine, and it stands somewhere near a modern oolong and a black Kimun tea. Now, there are bohea teas produced now that are authentic, and you can get them. And I think they taste very good. And what happens is that English people who are now putting milk and cream in tea like the higher caffeine kick, like the more pronounced flavor, which is smoothed out by the cream and sugar. So Bohea becomes, at the time of the revolution, the most popular tea being imported in America, and is a step toward the dominion of American tea drinking with black teas. When you think about Lipton tea, for instance, Lipton wasn't offering a green tea until relatively recently, when the green tea boom took place after people determined that it was good for you. So I pointed out the fact that there's a London connection. No merchants plied routes that went from China directly to Charleston. The East India Company, the British East India Company, had been granted a monopoly to trade in Asia, and they started trading tea in 1677, and they long exercised a monopoly on Chinese tea. This was a mercantilist organization operating within an empire which demanded that the metropole, that is London, be the nexus of all exchanges. No colony or territory or trade entrepot can trade directly with another colony or trade entrepreneur. Everything had to go through the London merchants. So things were shipped from China to London, and then from London to Charleston. And special vessels were designed in the 18th century for this particular trade. Here's an East Indiaman in a gale. One of the things that happens on sea voyages is that moisture, the salt in the atmosphere, the lack of temperature control has a way of ruining green tea. The delicacy is disrupted. So merchants discovered that oxidized fermented black teas like Bohea and Kemun hold up better under the ordeal of shipment. The product you get off the docks is pretty close to that which you got being put on from the docks at the beginning in China. So more and more of this is promoted by the shippers. And the stronger caffeine of these teas and better quality at the point of disembarkation. I mean, if you have a choice between a good black tea and a ruined green tea, you'd go for the good black tea. So this is what happens. And this is another thing that pushes the aesthetics of taste toward black tea over the course of the 18th century. And in China, there still remains a popular preference for the green teas. So, in the contest between the male coffee and female tea, a kind of cliche emerges, and that is the conflict between news and gossip. And it becomes a fixture of the culture war over gender. So what is kind of interesting to me is that when a queen actually comes upon the throne as the monarch in the reign of William and Mary in the 1690s, she revives the tea culture that had flourished under Catherine of Braganza. And she was also much taken with the notion of making tea culture stand for something more than just social commentary. You have occurring in the courtship culture of the time, something that you can see the plays devoted to the spas, like Tunbridge Wells, the famous Restoration comedy, the emergence of a new female character, the female wit. And what was the female wit? Well, it's presumed that in these places of socialization where rich merchants and aristocracy rub elbows for the first time, and their children of marriageable age are there in the pump room gazing at one another, everyone there has the money for good cosmetics and good clothes. So everyone's looking good. Now, if everyone's looking pretty good, how can you distinguish yourself from the general mass of good-looking types? And one of the ways that you can is being a fast process thinker. If you can speak impromptu off the top of your head and make observations and be witty, if you can deflect by a witticism the unwanted attentions of a very shallow fellow, if you're a woman, you have power. And so a new character is born in these places of urban sociability and resort recreation, the female wit. So in the 1690s, these female wits are showing up at the tea tables and enlivening the conversation there. And they're getting tired of the usual slanders against the female sex, the treatment of women's social contributions as trivial. So they engage in a wit war. They throw down the challenge. And there's this extraordinary book-length work called The Challenge or the Female War of 1697, where every slander or comment denigrating female ability that has ever been floated, and also the ability of clubs of women or groups of women, are answered by a woman from one of these tea tables. And we actually have in the final ones of these, there, I forget, 500 different queries answered in this book. An entire club of women chimes in. The entire tea table is talking here. So we're getting tea being more than sensibility or fashionability. It's also becoming the stimulant of thought, with women who are engaged in conversation that has intellectual content as part of it, as seen in these letters here. And this is in London. So in the provinces, we have the people coming here seeking their fortunes. They want land, they want a rise in status, they want recognition by the metropolis. Some of them want political power, some of them want social power and a measure of sovereignty. So you have many people, middling accomplishment or the younger sons of propertied families, showing up in places like Charleston. And what you do to advertise your allegiance to the center of fashionability, to the place where all power is adjudicated, where the manners are set, and the ambitions of England's landed gentry worked out, you start imitating what people in London are doing. So the material culture connected with tea, particularly the tea of the Bon-Ton, which is also including these tongs, creamers, slop bowls, and other things, starts appearing. And this is beyond the traditional Chinese stuff. And the person who knows more about this than anyone else is the person who's dug most of it up. That's Martha Zierden, who is here in the audience tonight. And I'm sure that she can comment on just how many teapots, saucers, cups, and slop bowls that she has found in her career with the Charleston Museum. But I know that it's been more than a dozen. So tea begins to be associated with social ambition, with aping metropolitan manners. So when an actual ape shows up in the Charleston docks in 1739, when Captain Flower docks the speaker at the Charleston docks and exhibits the first orangutan to visit the Northern Hemisphere as part of the show that he puts on the docks, he serves this ape a saucer of tea, which the ape downs with alacrity. And you'll see in the little blurb, the body is near 2 foot long, no tail at all. The feet and also the hands are exactly the shape of a hand of a human body. So handling the teacup was important, only somewhat longer and smaller, with all the lineaments, nails, etc. She walks on her feet, sits upon a chair, takes a dish of tea and drinks it. The body is covered with black hair, as the hair of a bear, but the skin is white, and the color of the face and hands is reddish, much like the Indians. Well, some strange cultural associations going on there, but the fact that this is newsworthy, that an ape is drinking tea, is suggesting a kind of symbolic thing that's going on. Provincials are aping metropolitan manners. Apes are aping provincial manners by consuming a cup of tea. When Charleston gets a newspaper in 1732, the South Carolina Gazette, one of the first things that it wants to do is kind of impose an authority over all of the sources of information, news, and social tidings that is circulating in the colony. So you have Mr. Monitor, a male person, suggesting that the women who are gathered in the tea tables are performing a public disservice by engaging in criticisms of unseemly sorts, and that women are probably better off being silent and therefore not chargeable with any sort of officiousness or vanity. Well, one of the members of a Charleston tea table, Penelope Aspen, chides the writer and defends the ancient prerogative of the tea table to speak and criticize. What, in the name of dullness, most venerable sirs, could move ye to endeavor to impose on us so severe a task as that of silence? Or, which is little better, speaking no more than is necessary. Nothing less, I fear, ye unconscionable creatures, than a barbarous avarice of engrossing all the talk of yourselves. So she's calling out exactly what the newspaper is doing. It wants to control the flow of information and opinion. And Penelope Aspen says, no way, Jose. What? Debar us from those sweet topics of conversation, dress and fashions, and the dear, delightful satisfaction of railing at our neighbors? Here she's burlesquing the types of criticisms that are being leveled at them by making them seem hyperbolic, right? So Penelope Aspen, female wit, Charlestonian, tea table savant. You know, while adjudicating fashion, regulating the world of courtship, policing social reputation, chiding excesses of conduct and appearance are meaningful tasks in provincial cities. There were women who aspired to do something more, and not just this work of wits. In the cities of North America, women in the 1720s and 1730s began to try to inject sense, poetry, and learning into the conversation over tea. And there were people up and down the coast, sort of central figures, who became the center of what we now recognize as salon culture. My favorite actually isn't from Charleston, but a woman named Elizabeth Macaulay in Philadelphia, who writes wonderful poetic satires of the various forms of manners and conduct in Philadelphia. And one of the things that they do, they see that the coffee house is beginning to ramify as a institution. Instead of just being about business and news, certain coffee houses begin to specialize in topics. Like there's a coffee house for physicians. There's a coffee house where everyone interested in map making and geography are. There's a coffee house for people who specialize in trade and political action in various colonies. There's a South Carolina coffee house in London, just as there is a London coffee house in South Carolina. So couldn't the tea table be made to engage also in kinds of specific inquiries into several sorts of things? And what happens is you see the tea table begin to move in certain cities in the direction of what we now recognize as a salon. And one of the hallmarks of the salon is that often writings are read aloud in them. And they're often assemblies which invite select men into the company. So it's a heterosocial conversation. So you have a women's intellectual culture emerging in certain of these tea tables. You see it in occasional correspondences in the South Carolina Gazette in the 1750s. So who were the ladies who hosted mid-18th century tea tables? Well, we got the names of a number. Marie DuBose Ragg, Elizabeth Ragg Manigault, Elizabeth Pitts Lambeau, Elizabeth Butler Young, Mary Bruton Dale, Hannah Palmer Skeen, Elizabeth Portal Poyas. Now, Miss Poyas is an interesting case. The people above her, I guess Thomas Dale is actually a physician and not a landed plantation owner, but the other people are all from land-owning families. who have a kind of plantation production country component to their family fortune, and a city townhouse where they perform merchant endeavors. Elizabeth Poyas's husband is a merchant who is importing goods and selling them, including tea. And she is the person who is sort of like the middle class pioneer for people who are from the middling orders who want to aspire to the gentility of upper class women engaging in tea culture. Now, how many tea bowls and tea cups and tea saucers are circulating in the city? When William Wilson, a rival to Mr. Poyas, dies, his inventory is noted in probate. And you'll see 34 Delft bowls, 33 Delft plates, 21 black and enamel teapots. Then we get them saucers. Over on the other thing, we get some of the slop bowls, dishes for sweets, and you even have some coffee cups. So the specialization between the beverages is maintained in this inventory. But that's a fair amount for just one merchant in a street of merchants to be selling to the people. We know that these women conducted coffee houses because they pop up and mentioned in letters. They sometimes appear in passing in a news note. And in some instances, we have the probate records of just how much teaware they possessed. So they do have a kind of interesting record. So what happens when Mrs. de Saussure decides that she wants to have you for tea? Well, this is what happens. After church, Mrs. D will approach you after the service. You're a townswoman, are invited to her residence on Tuesday at 5 p.m. This invitation is delivered verbally, not in writing. Tea is usually served during the hours between dinner, 3 o'clock, 4 p.m., and supper, 7 p.m. We have to remember that in the 18th century, lunch did not exist as a meal. The meals were breakfast, dinner, and supper. Sometimes there was an 11:30 soup that was available for working men. So even until the early 20th century, 3 o'clock dinner was considered a kind of sign of old Charleston foodways and folkways. And some memorable fiction is written about 3 o'clock dinner. Well, who was it? Julia Peterkin, who wrote that? I'll have to remember that. You arrive at exactly the time specified, and a servant will escort you inside. And Mrs. D will be standing by the set tea table, which is in the sitting room, usually by the front window. Now, Mrs. Lamboll, who is a superb gardener, sometimes holds her tea sittings in her flower garden, weather permitting and light permitting. You are shown to your chair and you sit. In front of you, the cups, saucers, spoons, sugar bowl, and slop bowl are already arrayed on the tea table. The tea is prepared out of the sitting room by servants, and the tea and hot water are placed in the pot, and the hot pot brought in and presented before the hostess. The hostess, not the servant, pours the tea into your cup. And this is the sign of your intimate connection with them. There's a kind of feminine I don't know, equality or sororal connection, and hand service by your friend is considered a hallmark of it. The number of attendees besides yourself are 3, and there's the hostess. They will all be women. No children are allowed in the room. A favorite dog might be. As soon as the tea pours, the talk flows. There are standard topics of conversation, and they're usually in this order. Who is new in town? What new goods have arrived lately from London? Whose daughter needs a matrimonial partner and who's a likely match? What scandalous things have occurred since we last convened? Who is ill and needs aid and company? And if the company is one of the intellectual sort that has a common interest or ruling passion, for instance, music or horticulture, the talk will turn to that. One drinks as much tea as one wishes, and it will continue to be poured until you turn your cup over in your saucer. Any remaining liquid in your tea is poured into the slop bowl before you turn the cup over. The gathering lasts an hour. I should say at least, not instead of, I put at most, but it rarely lasts 2 hours. So this is what we've learned from looking at every documentation of every tea table up and down the coast in the colonial period. And this is what you would have experienced here in Charleston. There are a couple things to note. By the time William Wilson was retailing teaware, the saucers, the tea cups had handles on them. Earlier in the 18th century, they lacked handles. There was no what we call sweet tea, which means sweet iced tea, consumed in Charleston by ladies until the 1870s. The price of tea falls somewhat between 1730 and 1760, allowing the aspiring middle classes to participate in the rites with greater ease. In the 1730s, there's stories of servants taking the tea leaves after they have been disposed of, stretching them out, drying them, and reusing them for themselves. That's how precious tea leaves were. Family tea becomes a habit, particularly in the off-season out in country plantations during the 18th century. And in family teas, your boys and daughters and whoever else in your extended family all sit around higgledy-piggledy. And this is where children learn to drink tea out in the summer. Now you're thinking drinking hot beverages out in the summer doesn't make any sense. No, it's a great thing to do. Hot beverages actually let you perspire, and perspiration cools you off. This is why people eat hot peppers in equatorial countries, because it induces the perspiration that leads to cooling from evaporation. No Darjeeling tea was available in Charleston until 1840s, after the English established their tea gardens in India. The sugar served in sugar bowls was loaf sugar, which was not as purely white as current granulated sugar. It did not come in cubes in the 18th century, but was snipped off from a loaf by little clippers. The quality of water was never discussed in the 18th century. A good thing, because the quality of water in Charleston was infamously bad, unless you had a cistern. And the sign of a really upper class and astute family was having a rainwater collection system as part of their premises. If the tea was too hot, some ladies spilled a little into the saucers to cool, and they would sip it from the saucer. Drinking from the saucer was not considered déclassé. Pinkies up is a 19th century gesture rather than one common at the time of the Charleston Tea Party. Finally, at the time of the 1770s and 1780s, coffee houses, taverns, and long rooms, which are a separate institution in Charleston, offered tea for gentlemen on their standing bills of fare at the end of the 18th century, suggesting that men had gender switched and developed a love of tea for themselves, which they would like to enjoy in their own settings. I've written on a lot of subjects. Here are a bunch of my books. You'll see that numbers of them are on food. Some are about colonial culture. Still others, still is about, it's the standard history of silent motion picture still photography. The most recent book is actually one I've written called The Ark of Taste, a collection of the rarest, most historically resonant and endangered plants in North America, which I published for Slow Food and was published earlier this year. So I've said what I have to say about tea, what I've prepared to say, but I know a fair amount more. So if you have questions, I welcome the opportunity to converse here. I have my teacup. I hope that you have yours.
Thank you, David Shields, so much. I think we'll let some folks put their questions in the chat if they're so inclined. One thing that struck me, we've just put in a little small tea exhibit here at the Powder Magazine and invite you all to come by. And one of the things that we were looking at and we included in our exhibit was a page out of the Poyas notebook. The James, I think it was James Poyas, must have been the husband of Mrs. Poyas, was that merchant. And so his inventory of the stuff that he's bringing into Charleston is really fascinating to see, and a bunch of inventories of his shipments coming in the 1760s have all sorts of tea and tea wares coming into Charleston, along with gunpowder, which, as the Powder Magazine, we thought was really fascinating, that tea and gunpowder were coming in together. But I think that's probably maybe due to East India Company shipments, would you think?
Right, and we have to remember that there is a variety of tea just because of the contiguity of shipping gunpowder with tea that is called gunpowder green tea, and you can get it now. So Poyas is there at the dawn of that.
Right, right. So we have a couple of we've got a couple of questions. Denise says, great talk. You've used the words cream and milk. Is there any information out there that cream was used by early tea drinkers, or would it have been milk?
Catherine of Braganza was someone who used tea cream for lots of different things, but never for tea. But cream was used, particularly in London, as the dulcifier for tea, particularly early in the 1710s and 1720s. I have no specific documentation that it was used here in Charleston, but cream is generally available everywhere. And even though a surprising amount of it is being imported from New York in the 18th century,
Yeah.
rather than being produced by local cows. And that's where the cheese is coming from when
Right.
one who is at Santee, Arcangelo Santee, makes the first mac and cheese in Charleston in 1791. He he uses the Camellia durum flower that had been grown out in Ebenezer, Georgia by the Salzburgers, which is a traditional Sicilian pasta wheat, and a New York imitation Parmesan that was
That
being.
is a new one for our culinary guide. So mac and cheese shows up in Charleston in 1791, y'all. That is, my daughter will love that too. So we got one question too, was there a name for the orangutan? I know that y'all, if you want to see an interesting picture, I'll try and repost it on our Facebook, but one of our followers put David's kind of story about the orangutan coming in the 1730s into an AI program and came out with this really fantastic picture of an orangutan drinking tea on the docks in Charleston. So I'll try to
Yes,
share
it's
that video.
definitely worth seeing.
Yeah. Does she have a name, or we don't think so?
It wasn't named. The news descriptions of this event were published up and down the seacoast. So it was, he didn't go to any other port in North America. So it was only Charleston that saw the first orangutan.
Oh, that's crazy. That is crazy. We have a great question from Molly Fortune, who heads up the South Carolina 250th Commission. And that's kind of how we got started with all this tea parties and tea protests and everything. She was asking, if I were to taste tea from the 18th century, would it be very different from what we have now become accustomed to?
Oh, well, since you can actually get versions of Bohea and Hisan tea, you can taste exactly the way those teas have been processed have not altered. I would suggest that the only difference would be the transportation and shipping is a lot better now than it was then. So the taste would probably be cleaner and better.
Right. Well, it's actually it's interesting because with this tea protest that we're celebrating in early December, we have to remember that this tea, which was confiscated in 1773, sat in the basement of the old Exchange Building in 257 chests for over 3 years. Well, not quite 3 years. It sat in a basement and then it was sold and gleefully drunk by people. They lapped it up because they hadn't had their tea in so long.
One of the things which
yeah.
interests me is that I went to the American Antiquarian Society, and they have bottles of the tea leaves collected at the time of the Boston Tea Party that had washed up on shore.
Yeah.
And so I think you can actually see them on the site of the American Antiquarian Society, the tea from the Boston. So it's theoretically conceivable to drink, even in 2023, some Tea Party tea, if you can convince the American Antiquarian Society to surrender part of its treasure trove.
I doubt it. But well, before too many people sail away, and we'll keep going through some of these, I just want to remind you that we've got a great talk coming up next week with Ann Smart Martin, and she's going to really get into the sort of tea wares and all the material culture surrounding tea. And then the week after that, that'll be the 15th, we'll wrap up with Dr. James Victor, who's, I told David he's zooming in from Hong Kong. So it'll actually be the next morning for him. When we talk to him, it'll be 7 in the morning. It'll be 6 at night for us the previous day. But he's going to kind of talk about the tea protests of 1773 and 1774. And then the main event that we're kind of looking at, and you can find out more about on our Powder Magazine website, powdermagazine.org, is the Tea Party protest that we're putting on as a commemorative event for the 250th anniversary. And that'll be on December 2nd at 10 in the morning in front of the old Exchange building. We hope everybody can come out for that. We've got a whole day of free and open to the public stuff. You'll be able to go into the basement of the Exchange building. You'll be able to try some colonial teas that Oliver Pluff and Company sells. They have bohea tea and some other varieties. The Powder Magazine Museum will be open for free tours, as will the South Carolina Historical Society's museum and the Hayward Washington Backhouse. So, and I think even the Spirit of South Carolina is going to be docked and open for tours. So lots to do on December 2nd. So don't forget that. So I guess one other thing, let's see. Betty Parker Ellis was asking about more in the history of the teacup handles. When did handles appear, and were there practical shipping reasons for not having them?
This is the question you should say for Ann Smart Martin next week.
Yeah.
But if Martha Zierden is still here, I'm sure that she has dialed in what's available in terms of Charleston's history of teacups handles.
You do see them, without the handles, and you see people kind of pinching them. And I was sort of thinking, maybe that's where the pinky came up, is because when you pinch the edge of the cup, but maybe that's probably not right. So, but interesting stuff. Yes, we'll definitely cover those teacups next week as well. And you can see on the Powder Magazine website, if you click on the little roving teapot, you'll go to a whole web page about tea and tea party protests and everything. And under the videos tab, we have Martha. We have a video of Martha Zierden at the Charleston Museum talking about different tea wares that she's excavated. So I'd encourage you to take a look at some of those videos. They're wonderful. So you can kind of bone up on some of those tea wares, and then look forward next week to Ann Smart Martin's talk. And I hope everybody will sign up for that as well. But listen, thanks everybody so much. We're about at 1/4 so we'll probably cut it off there. But thank you so much for attending, and we're looking forward to having 2 more really wonderful lectures. And David, can't thank you enough. That was really, really great information, and hopefully we'll see you in the next 2 lectures as well.
Right, and I urge you all to listen to Ann Smart Martin. She and I were collaborators a number of years ago on an American Revolution workshop for high school teachers, and every presentation she made sort of re-educated me about fundamental aspects of the experience of the material world and that era. There's nobody better. Right. We really lucked out with some amazing speakers. So thank you so much. And I guess we'll see you guys next week. Thanks so much. Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Okay. Bye.